29 standalone institutions, many of them being private initiatives. India is strongly committed to holistic, inclusive, and sustainable development and to meeting the goals and targets set under the Sustainable Development Goals framework on time. India has developed a robust Sustainable Development Goals localization model whereby states and districts drive the adoption of global goals and targets with local means of implementation, monitoring, and evaluation framework. India recently assessed its achievements on Sustainable Development Goals both at the union and state level and presents its voluntary national review to the United Nations High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. The first voluntary national review was submitted in 2017 and the second one in 2020. Despite the unprecedented challenges of the pandemic, India in 2022 has achieved more than 50% target in most of the goals of Agenda 2030. I thank you.
That concludes individual presentation from all members of my delegation. I now hand over the floor back to you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the presentation, all the work, serious work done by the delegation, and for being here with us. Vamos a comenzar nuestro diálogo interactivo. Les recuerdo que el tiempo de intervención son 55 segundos. El uso de las palabras recomendar o recomendación garantizará que las partes pertinentes de sus declaraciones se incluyan en la sección de recomendaciones del informe. Tiene la palabra en primer lugar el representante de la República Democrática de Corea.
Thank you, Mr. President. Pleased for being first. The DPRK delegation warmly welcomes the delegation of India and notes with appreciation its first national report in depth to the UPR. We commend the government of India for its strong efforts and tangible progress in implementing comprehensive development strategy through accelerated economic growth and broader social safety nets, with a strong focus on vulnerable groups and on women and children. Wishing the India further success, we have two recommendations. One, continue its efforts to ensure safety and security of women, eliminate all forms of discrimination against women, and ensure their empowerment. Two, continue its efforts for ensuring universal access to affordable health care for all, and with a special emphasis on groups in situations of vulnerability, and enhancing the quality.
Tiene la palabra Dinamarca.
Mr. President, Denmark welcomes the delegation of India. Denmark commends India's efforts in improving gender rights for women, girls, and transgender people, and that India had made strong efforts to combat child labor with the ratification of ILO Convention number 138 and 182. Women and girls are especially vulnerable to the repercussions of climate change. Denmark recommends India to 1. Implement existing measures and ensure that adequate resources are set aside to strengthen girls' education and women's labor market participation in order to better their economic resilience towards climate change repercussions. 2. Improve the enforcement of the legal provisions to prohibiting harmful and discriminatory practices against women and girls in accordance with CEDAW. 3. Ratify the Convention Against Torture. Denmark wishes India a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. Djibouti, vous avez la parole.
Djibouti, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président, Djibouti souhaite la bienvenue à la délégation de haut niveau de l'Inde et la remercie pour la présentation de son rapport national. Ma délégation salue l'Inde pour le renforcement de ses mesures prises en faveur de l'égalité et de la non-discrimination et l'encourage à fournir des protections adéquates en faveur des minorités, des castes et des populations vulnérables. Aussi, Djibouti souhaite formuler à l'Inde les recommandations suivantes. Premièrement, continuer la poursuite de la mise en œuvre des programmes et mesures d'accès au logement pour les sans-abri ainsi que celles visant une aide sans taudis dans le cadre de l'atteinte des objectifs Un logement pour tous d'ici 2024. Deuxièmement, intensifier les efforts de lutte contre le traite des personnes, notamment le travail forcé et la servitude en accélérant le processus de mise en œuvre du projet de loi 2022 sur la prévention, la prise en charge et la réadaptation des personnes victimes de la traite. Enfin, je vous souhaite plein succès à l'Inde à l'occasion de cet examen. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Tiene la palabra Egipto por video.
السيد الرئيس يثني وفد مصر على تعاون حكومة الهند مع الآليات المعنية بحقوق الإنسان واستخدامها بتقديم تقارير
India on its cooperation with the human rights mechanisms. We welcome the role played by the National Human Rights Committee. In the context of this dialogue, we have the following recommendations to make. First of all, to increase expenditure to ensure universal access to quality healthcare. Secondly, to expand the scope of the Act on Schooling for Children of 2009 to ensure that all children can benefit from 12 years of schooling. Thirdly, to continue efforts to ensure access to drinking water and sanitation and appropriate hygiene facilities, in particular for girls and women. We wish India every success.
Thank you. El Salvador tiene la palabra.
El Salvador, please.
Señor Presidente, agradecemos a la delegación de la India por la presentación de su informe. Con un espíritu constructivo, El Salvador recomienda fortalecer sus políticas para la mitigación de la pobreza, continuar y fortalecer su estrategia para asegurar el acceso universal a una asistencia médica asequible para todos, mediante el enfoque de la universalización, la asequibilidad y la mejora de las infraestructuras médicas. Continuar la adopción de medidas para eliminar todas las formas de malnutrición mediante el aumento de la seguridad alimentaria en todo su territorio, acelerar y fortalecer las medidas para prevenir y proteger a los niños de la explotación sexual, el castigo corporal, el matrimonio infantil y el trabajo infantil, así como para brindar apoyo a los niños víctimas de delitos sexuales. Deseamos a India éxitos en la implementación de las recomendaciones. Gracias.
Gracias. Estonia tiene la palabra. Embajadora.
Estonia welcomes the delegation of India to this UPR session. We welcome India's efforts to tackle the poverty and ensure greater access to water and sanitation, and the government's commitment to eradicate violence against women. Estonia gladly notes that India has ratified ILO conventions on minimum age to employment and on the worst forms of child labor. Estonia would like to recommend India to carefully review the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act and the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act to ensure freedom of expression, assembly and association, and the protection of civil society organizations and human rights defenders. Persistently work to ensure and protect independent judiciary and functioning human rights institutions. Accept a country visit from the special rapporteurs on torture, right to privacy, right to freedom of assembly and association. Ratify the Convention Against Torture and its optional protocol, the second optional protocol to the ICCPR and the Rome Statute. Estonia wishes a successful review meeting. I thank you.
Thank you. Eswatini tiene la palabra.
Thank you, Mr. President. Eswatini warmly welcomes the delegation from India. We welcome developments made during the last review process. We applaud India for measures taken to combat corruption, improve accountability in government institutions. In the spirit of constructive dialogue, Eswatini recommends to India: 1. Ratify the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. 2. Ensure that legislation for healthcare workforce ensures that healthcare workers are paid fair wages. 3. Continue strengthening existing child protection mechanism and dissuade child labor. 4. Further strengthen laws that protect religious minorities. In conclusion, Eswatini wishes India success in its review. I thank you.
Thank you. Etiopía tiene la palabra.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ethiopia welcomes the high-level delegation of India to this UPR session and thanks the delegation for the comprehensive national report and oral update today. Ethiopia commends India for implementing the recommendation received during the previous UPR cycles and for the well performance on 8 of the 15 SDGs in 2020-2021, despite the COVID-19 pandemic. New measures introduced for the welfare and empowerment of women and children, persons with disabilities and other marginalized communities are also to be commended. Ethiopia would like to make the following 3 recommendations. 1, reinforce efforts to implement transformational developmental initiatives undertaken to leave no one behind. 2, strengthen the efforts of implementation of the Integrated Child Development Scheme and Midday Meal Scheme in schools. 3, step up efforts to eliminate any type of caste-based discrimination in practice. I thank you.
Thank you. Fiji tiene la palabra.
Mr. President, Fiji welcomes the delegation of India and thanks them for their national report. We especially commend the Indian government's commitment to ratify the UN Convention Against Torture, or UNHCT, India's strengthening of existing legal frameworks guaranteeing protection against torture, its widespread capacity building initiatives on torture prevention, and its acceptance in all 3 previous UPR cycles to ratify UNHCT is encouraging and commendable. As a co-state of the Convention Against Torture initiative, Fiji takes this opportunity to emphasize that the ratification and implementation of UNHCT would present India with the opportunity to further strengthen its national anti-torture framework and to join the international community in united efforts against torture and ill treatment. In the spirit of constructive engagement, Fiji recommends that the Government of India ratify the UN Convention Against Torture. I thank you.
Thank you. Finland tiene la palabra, embajadora.
Finland welcomes the engagement of India in the UPR process. We commend India for the achievements made, including the ruling of the Supreme Court of India that all women can obtain abortions up to 24 weeks into their pregnancies. Finland offers the following recommendations. 1, to take measures to stop violence against women with disabilities by implementing provisions of amended criminal laws pertaining to sexual violence. 2, to decentralize and simplify the unique disability identity card system and its certification process. 3, to strengthen the implementation of the Whistleblowers Protection Act 2014 and provide universal protection to the whistleblowers. Finland wishes India a successful UPR. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Países Bajos tienen la palabra.
The Netherlands, you have the floor.
Mr. President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands thanks India for its national report. We commend India on progress in ensuring the rights of women and girls, such as the prohibition of gender-based selective abortion, child marriages, sexual harassment in the workplace, and marital rape. However, much remains to be done to improve the situation of women and girls and other vulnerable groups badly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. The Netherlands recommends India to strengthen enforcement mechanisms for the prevention of gender-based violence by allocating additional budget for the elimination on the long term through early childhood education and awareness raising, and by establishing and resourcing institutions to support victims, and 2, to take measures to prevent the abuse of so-called anti-conversion laws, ensuring that such laws do not infringe upon the constitutionally guaranteed freedom of religion and belief.
Le Gabon a la parole. Le
Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. La délégation du Gabon souhaite la bienvenue à la délégation de l'Inde et la remercie pour la présentation de son rapport national. Nous notons avec satisfaction que l'Inde est fermement
particularly in the fields of poverty reduction, education, health, access to housing and safe drinking waters, among others. The Lao PTI would like to offer 2 recommendations. First, strengthen the implementation of national development strategy to achieve sustainable development and poverty eradication. Second, continue efforts to ensure equal access to quality education for all children. We wish India success in these UPR reviews. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Latvia tiene la
I call on Latvia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Latvia welcomes the delegation of India to the UPR Working Group and thanks for presenting its national report. We would like to recommend 1. To establish a moratorium on death penalty with a view to its eventual abolition and consider ratifying the second optional protocol of the ICCPR. 2. To ratify UNHCR. 3. To take measures to foster a safe, respectful and enabling environment for civil society and human rights defenders, especially women and indigenous human rights defenders, free from persecution, intimidation and harassment. 4. To take all necessary measures, both in law and in practice, to empower women and girls and to combat violence against them, including domestic violence. And 5. To protect and ensure the rights of persons belonging to ethnic and religious minorities. Latvia wishes the delegation of India success in the review. I thank you.
Thank you. Lebanon.
I call on Lebanon by Zoom.
Mr. President, Lebanon warmly welcomes the delegation of India and thanks them for their presentation, which illustrates India's efforts to promote and protect human rights. We welcome the development of the business responsibility framework and the participation of businesses in securing the basic rights of citizens. In a spirit of constructive dialogue, we would like to recommend 1. Continue to strengthen measures to increase livelihood opportunities, especially for women empowerment and to address rural poverty. 2. Take further steps to implement the existing laws and policies to combat sexual offences against women and children. In conclusion, we wish India all the success in their review. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Liechtenstein.
I call on Liechtenstein by video.
Liechtenstein welcomes the distinguished delegation of India and wishes to thank for the information provided in the introductory statement and in the national report. In a constructive spirit, Liechtenstein recommends that India first take concrete steps in view of abolishing the death penalty. Second, ensure compliance with national legislation prohibiting corporal punishment in schools through prevention, response, redress, and accountability. Third, allocate adequate resources to expedite adjudication of cases of violence against women. Fourth, accede to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. We wish you a successful UPR and thank you.
Thank you. Lithuania.
I call on Lithuania, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President. Lithuania warmly welcomes the delegation of India and thanks for its national report. We commend the positive steps taken by India in further improving the human rights record since the last UPR. To continue that positive momentum, we would like to provide the following recommendations for India. 1. Consider reviewing national regulations to reinforce freedoms of expression, peaceful assembly and association. 2. Aim to provide necessary resources to expedite adjudication of cases of violence against women. 3. Consider the ratification of the second optional protocol to the ICCPR and introduce moratorium on the death penalty as the first step towards abolishment. 4. Continue efforts towards increasing access to education for marginalized communities. Lithuania wishes India a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. Luxembourg.
I call on Luxembourg. Ambassador, you have the floor. Thank you, President. Luxembourg welcomes the Indian delegation and thanks it for its national report and efforts made to implement recommendations from previous cycles. We'd like to make the following recommendations. 1. Immediately release all human rights defenders in detention. 2. Adopt and implement a budgeted multi-sectoral plan to curb violence against children. 3. Improve protection structures for women from violence, particularly domestic violence. 4. Prevent all forms of harassment by law enforcement against the LGBTQI+ community. 5. Make human rights and environmental impact studies obligatory for all mega projects. And 6. Sign up to the 1954 and 61 conventions on statelessness and take all the necessary measures to implement them. Thank you. Thank you. I call on Malawi.
Malawi welcomes India to this review and thanks the delegation for the comprehensive presentation. In the spirit of constructive dialogue, Malawi makes the following recommendations to India. 1. Consider ratifying the Convention Against Discrimination in Education. 2. Consider aligning its legislation with the Education 2030 Framework for Action, which requires states to ensure at least 12 years of free primary and secondary education, of which at least 9 were compulsory and 1 year of free compulsory pre-primary education. 3. address the digital gender and equity divide in education, ensuring that the right to education of all children was made through traditional and hybrid forms of education. Malawi wishes the Republic of India a successful review. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Malaysia.
I call on Malaysia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Malaysia thanks India for its report. Malaysia welcomes India's pragmatic, transparent and inclusive approach in advancing the rights of the most vulnerable. We encourage India to continue efforts to eliminate all forms of malnutrition by increasing food security and provide adequate housing for all. In the spirit of constructive engagement, Malaysia recommends the following. First, consider establishing the National Mechanism for Implementation and Follow-up, NMRF, for effective implementation of UPR recommendations, taking into account the national context. Second, consider strengthening legal and policy measures to ensure the right to privacy. And third, take concrete steps to raise awareness on and eliminate extremist ideology that promotes and condones violence and discrimination against religious minorities in India. We wish India a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. Maldives.
I call on Maldives. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Maldives warmly welcomes the high-level delegation from the Republic of India to the fourth cycle of the Universal Periodic Review and thanks the delegation for their presentation today. India is our neighbor, our friend and our development partner. The Maldives has been a beneficiary of India's development assistance and its capacity building programs. This assistance was particularly important during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Maldives commends India for the significant achievements it has made in promoting and protecting the rights of its over 1 billion people in the largest democracy in the world. In particular, the Maldives welcomes the significant measures taken to decrease its environmental footprint, including banning the manufacture, import, stocking, distribution, sale and use of single-use plastics. The Maldives is confident that India will continue to make progress in the promotion and protection of human rights as guaranteed by its constitution. We wish India every success in this review. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.
I call on Mali. You have the floor. Thank you, President. Mali bids a warm welcome to the Indian delegation. We congratulate you on your detailed presentation of the national report. My delegation commends the government's adoption of a number of strategies for the short, medium and long term in order to reduce poverty and fight inequalities. Mali is also pleased to note significant measures to strengthen democracy, notably by giving constitutional status to the National Commission for Backward Classes and also reserving certain seats for scheduled castes and tribes in the Assembly of the People and state assemblies. We believe that extra efforts should be made to give rural population access to basic social services. Recommendations: one, to strengthen the National Human Rights Commission to bring it into line with the Paris Principles and to improve access to populations to drinking water. Malta has the floor.
President, Mauritius would like to welcome very warmly the high-level delegation from India led by Minister Sanjay Verma. We thank India for its report. Mauritius would like to commend the Government of India for its leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic and for the support India extended to more than 150 countries, including Mauritius, by providing medical and pharmaceutical supplies, the spirit of Vasudev Kutumbakam. We further commend the efforts of India for spearheading the International Solar Alliance and the Coalition for Disaster-Resilient Infrastructure as part of India's partnership initiatives to help strengthen disaster resilience and grow solar energy. We applaud India for the steps taken to alleviate poverty and to empower girl children by educating them. We wish the delegation of India fruitful discussions and continued success and progress. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Marshall.
I call on Marshall Islands via Zoom.
Tiene la palabra. Marshall Islands, are you connected?
Thank you, Mr. President.
Yeah.
The Republic of the Marshall Islands warmly welcomes the delegation of India to this fourth UPR cycle and thanks them for their well-prepared presentation. At the outset, we convey our condolences to the victims of the recent tragedy in Morphe. We urge the government to continue to assist their families and to take precautions to avoid such tragedies in the future. We constructively offer the following recommendations for India's consideration. 1. Address caste-based discrimination against minorities by providing them with equal access to water and sanitation service and resources through implementation of context-specific poverty alleviation programs. 2, ensure that adequate resources are available to expedite adjudication of cases of violence against women. And 3, continue efforts to streamline its NDCs with the Paris Agreement goals. We wish the delegation every success during its 4th UPR cycle. And thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you. Mauritania.
I call on Mauritania.
Thank you. Mr. President, we welcome the Indian delegation and thank them for the comprehensive presentation of the national report. The report details the reforms and measures adopted by the government since the last UPR to promote and protect human rights. We commend the concerted efforts to improve school enrollment across India and promote the widest possible access to basic education. We recommend the following. 1. Pursue further measures to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women and ensure full empowerment. 2. Redouble efforts to promote the culture of religious tolerance. 3. Step up efforts to combat corruption. In closing, we wish the Indian delegation a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. Mexico tiene la...
Thank you. Mexico has the floor. Thank you, Mr. President. We would like to welcome the entire high-level delegation from India to Geneva. We would like to thank you for the presentation of a report. We welcome the decriminalization of homosexuality by the Supreme Court, and we recognize the efforts made by the government to reduce the levels of child marriage. Mexico recommends to ensure the effective investigation and punishment of cases of sexual abuse against women and girls, particularly for the lowest castes and the most vulnerable population. 2, to ratify the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Degrading, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment, and the Second Optional Protocol of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. 3, to review the design and implementation of the National Citizens Registry to avoid statelessness, the denial of nationality, arbitrary detention, or expulsions. 4th, to adopt a comprehensive law on the protection of human rights defenders. Mexico would like to offer sharing its experience in the area. We wish India every success. Thank you.
Gracias, Mongolia.
Thank you, Mongolia.
Mr. President, my delegation notes India's strong commitment to improve the environment and address climate change and commends the country's Supreme Court for acknowledging the right to live in a healthy environment is an essential element of the right to life. India's response to global pandemic indeed has been preemptive and proactive, and taking this opportunity, my delegation expresses our heartfelt gratitude for the government of India for its generous and timely humanitarian support around the globe. Mongolia commends that the Republic of India to accelerate the works of the National Human Rights Commission's Task Force for preparation of the National Plan of Action on Human Rights. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Montenegro tiene la palabra.
Montenegro is recognized.
Montenegro welcomes the distinguished delegation of India. Montenegro commends India's commitment to sustainable development with the aim of leaving no one behind. This is reflected in its national development agenda, which corresponds to the 2030 agenda. We also recognize the number of actions taken to strengthen the country's human rights records since the last UPR. Montenegro recommends to India 1. To ratify all international instruments that India has already signed, particularly the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, and 2. To ensure that explicit legal prohibition of corporal punishment is observed in all schools. We wish India all success in the review. Thank you.
Thank you. Marruecos.
Morocco has the floor.
Monsieur le Président, I would like to welcome the distinguished delegation of India to its 4th cycle UPR review and would like to commend India for taking important steps to implement most of the recommendations since the previous cycle. We positively note that the government of India introduced during the COVID pandemic an array of initiatives and focused interventions to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic and protect lives and livelihoods. In a spirit of constructive engagement, the Kingdom of Morocco would like to make the following recommendation to the government of India. First, to consider ratifying the Unhrc, 2, to remain committed to increase access to safe and clean drinking water in rural areas. 3, to continue efforts aiming at ensuring universal access to affordable health care for all. We wish the delegation of India a successful review. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Mozambique tem a palavra.
Mozambique is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. We welcome the distinguished delegation of India for the submission of their comprehensive country report. Mozambique praises India for the progress made in the country's move toward the realization of human rights since the previous cycle of UPR. Mozambique offered the following recommendation to India. 1, to continue effort to strengthen the national program against poverty. 2, to continue with the campaign to prevent child marriage. 3, to improve and strengthen legal and institutional framework to protect children from child forced labor. Mozambique wishes India every success in the present UPR exercise. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Namibia tiene la palabra.
Namibia is recognized through video.
Thank you, Mr. President. Namibia warmly welcomes the esteemed delegation of India and thank them for submitting a comprehensive national report outlining the progress made in promoting and protecting human rights in India since its last review in 2017. We commend India for the remarkable efforts, which among others include the establishment of national institutions to address violence against women and girls. There, however, remains room for improvement, and Namibia therefore offers the following recommendations for consideration by India. 1, ratify the optional protocol to the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. 2, ratify the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees and its 1967 protocol. We wish the delegation of India a successful review. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Nepal tiene la palabra.
Nepal is recognized.
Mr. President, Nepal warmly welcomes the delegation of India to the 4th cycle of UPR and thank them for the presentation of national report. We appreciate various initiatives undertaken by India towards eradication of poverty with a strong focus on vulnerable groups, women and children. In a constructive spirit, Nepal recommends India the following for their consideration. 1, strengthen its effort to combat discrimination and violence against women, girls and minority communities. 2, continue its effort to prevent child marriage, child labor and other forms of child exploitation. And 3, continue strengthening food safety net programs to promote food security and eradicate malnutrition. We wish India a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. La France, Ambassadeur.
France is recognized. You have the floor, Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, France would like to warmly welcome the delegation of India and to thank them for their report, a report we considered in great depth. We welcome the progress made by India in the area of combating child labor and respecting the right of the LGBTI+ community. France encourages Indian authorities to implement the following recommendations. First, to contemplate ratifying the 2nd optional protocol of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, so as to abolish the death penalty. 2, to continue efforts made in combating violence and discrimination against women, namely by ratifying the optional protocol on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women and the Convention on the Prevention and Against Domestic Violence and Violence Against Women. 3, to continue the implementation of the Partnership and Democracy Program. 4, to ratify the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment.
Paul.
Niger has the floor. Thank you. Mr. President, Niger would like to warmly welcome the delegation of India and to commend them for the presentation of their national report. We appreciate the progress made by India in guaranteeing universal access to health care, as well as the measures that they have taken to put an end to poverty in all its forms. Constructively, Niger would like to recommend to India to consider ratifying the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, to consider ratifying the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearances, and third recommendation, to continue efforts to combat violence against women. Lastly, we wish India every success in this review. Thank you. Thank you. Norway.
Norway notes the positive steps taken by India since the last review, including decriminalizing consensual same-sex relations and the important progress that has been made in poverty alleviation. Norway recommends that India, first, increases efforts to enforce national legislation to prevent and combat gender-based violence against all women and girls. Second, initiates legal and other measures to combat hate speech, in line with recommendations made by the Law Commission of India Report number 267, 2017. Third, strengthens the capacity of the judiciary to reduce delays in judicial proceedings and guarantee the right to a speedy trial. And fourth, revises the Armed Force Special Powers Act to ensure compliance with obligations under the ICCPR and considers reducing the Act's geographic scope. I thank you.
Thank you. Oman. Ambassador, you have the floor.
سعادة الرئيس يسرني أن أرحب برئيس وفد جمهورية الهند.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to welcome the head of delegation of India, as well as the delegation that accompanies him. We appreciate the efforts made by India in drafting its national report, as well as the participatory approach that led to its drafting. This shows commitment to the UPR. We considered the national report, which shows your respect to the obligations that arise from United Nations conventions and protocols, as well as India's commitment to all-embracing sustainable, equitable development and the national plan. We recommend continue efforts to implement the plan for children. Also, continue measures to avoid malnutrition and improve food security and guarantee proper nutrition for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Pakistan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. In India continue to be violated with impunity. These abuses have been widely documented. India's standing invitation to UN Special Procedure mandate holders to Kashmir during its previous UPR never materialized. We therefore recommend the following. 1. Reverse illegal steps taken since 5th August 2019 in occupied Jammu and Kashmir and cease demographic engineering. 2. Demonstrate its commitment to international law by complying with Article 25 of UN Charter and implementing UNSC resolutions on Jammu and Kashmir. 3. Accept recommendations made in the OHCHR's Kashmir reports and allow the office and independent observers access to the occupied territory. 4. End all human rights violations and release Kashmiri political prisoners, journalists and human rights defenders. 5. Repeal the AFSPA, J&K Public Safety Act, National Security Act, Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens. 6. Prosecute public officials inciting hate crimes. And lastly, ratify the Convention Against Torture. I thank you.
Thank you. Israel, tiene la palabra.
Israel has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Israel would like to warmly welcome the delegation of India and thank it for its national report. Israel welcomes the launch of the Accessible India campaign and various steps India has taken to increase women's participation in the workforce. Israel also commends India for the adoption of the Transgender Person Act in 2019. We would like to recommend the following. 1. To continue to strengthen measures aimed at protecting transgender persons, including through the full implementation of the Transgender Persons Act. 2. To take further measures to combat violence against women as well as support victims and survivors of such violence. And 3. To improve the access of persons with disabilities to education, vocational training and healthcare facilities. We would like to wish the delegation of India successful UPR.
Thank you. Paraguay tiene la palabra.
Paraguay has the floor. Thank you, Mr. President. Paraguay would like to greet the delegation of India and express our appreciation for the presentation of the report. We appreciate the efforts made and the progress made by India, and we would like to convey our concern over the situation of indigenous peoples, the refugee, and violence against women, and would like to encourage them to pursue efforts to face these specific challenges. With all due respect, Paraguay would like to recommend, first, to ratify the ILO Convention on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples, number 169, as well as the Convention on the Status of Refugees. 2. To improve regulatory mechanisms and policies to combat gender violence. 3. To create a national permanent mechanism for the implementation, reporting, and follow-up on the recommendations on human rights, considering the possibility of receiving cooperation in this regard as part of the 16th and 17th Sustainable Development Goal. Thank you. Peru. Thank you. Peru would like to welcome the delegation of the Republic of India, and we would like to express appreciation for the presentation of the report. Constructively, we recommend, first, to redouble ongoing efforts for the ratification of the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. 2. To undertake the necessary reforms so as to include in its legislation an explicit prohibition of any and all type of violence, including gender-based violence, in educational establishments. 3. To improve the capabilities of the health sector to address gender violence at all levels, including medical and legal assistance for survivors of sexual violence. We wish India every success. Thank you. Thank you, Philippines.
Thank you, Chair. The Philippines congratulates India on the significant strides made since the third cycle of the UPR. We laud efforts to enhance and advance the SDGs, address climate change, guarantee rights of all, especially persons and groups in vulnerable situations, and advocate for COVID-19 vaccines. My delegation recommends the following. 1. Strengthen measures to improve maternal health and increase access to obstetric services to reduce maternal and child mortality. 2. Continue to implement the Housing for All policy to realize SDG 11. 3. Continue sustained efforts to scale up climate action through adoption of clean and efficient energy systems, among other measures. The Philippines wishes India success in this UPR. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. A delegação de Portugal.
Portugal has the floor.
Gracias, Senhor Presidente. Portugal welcomes the delegation of India. We commend the enactment of the Transgender Persons Act and the consolidation of the existing labour legislation into 4 labour codes. Portugal would like to recommend that India, 1. Introduces a moratorium on executions with a view to the abolition of the death penalty. 2. Implements a welfare benefit system for all persons living in situations of extreme poverty, with the goal of reducing inequalities and ensure the enjoyment of economic, social and cultural rights, including for persons with disabilities and ethnic and religious minorities. 3. Identifies and repeals all legal provisions which might discriminate against persons affected by leprosy and passes a new bill to that effect in accordance with the India Law Commission's 2015 report. Portugal wishes to India a very successful UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. Qatar.
شكرا أعطي الكلمة لوفد قطر. My delegation would like to welcome the delegation of India, and we would like to thank the delegation for presenting the national report on the recommendations that have been accepted by India during the UPR in its third cycle. And the report has reflected all the achievements that have been made to implement human rights. So we greatly value all the efforts that have been made towards attaining SDG, especially SDG 4 through the policy of education for 2020. And here we recommend that all efforts be made to ensure free of charge education for all children. We also recommend that a strategy be adopted to inform of the rights of persons with disabilities and to combat discrimination against them. And we would like to wish India a successful UPR and more prosperity. I thank you, sir.
Shukran. Tiene la palabra República.
Thank you. The Republic of Korea is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of Korea commends India for the progress made in safeguarding the rights of vulnerable groups, including women, children, and persons with disability. We especially welcome India's new initiatives and policies aiming to ensure universal access to affordable health care and quality education. With such progress in mind, we would like to make the following recommendations. First, strengthen efforts to ratify the Convention Against Torture. Second, prioritize the promotion of the rights of religious minorities and marginalized social groups in law and in practice by tackling intolerance and discrimination on any ground. Lastly, ensure that laws regulating freedom of peaceful assembly and association, including the Foreign Contribution Act, are fully compliant with international standards. Thank you.
Thank you. Moldova tiene la palabra.
Moldova is recognized.
Mr. President, the Republic of Moldova welcomes the distinguished delegation of India and commends its efforts in promoting the human rights agenda as well as for its comprehensive governance plan and large-scale digitalization of access to public services, including in most remote regions. In a constructive spirit, we would like to make the following 3 recommendations. 1. To declare a moratorium on execution as a first step towards abolishing the death penalty. 2. To undertake all necessary measures to prevent and fight child labor and to investigate and prosecute cases of violence against women and girls while ensuring adequate medical and legal care to victims. 3. To ratify the Convention Against Torture and the optional protocol thereto. Finally, we wish India every success during its UPR cycle. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Federation.
The Russian Federation, please. President, we thank the Indian delegation for the presentation of the report. We note with satisfaction the progress achieved by India towards implementing the recommendations of the 3rd UPR cycle. Equally praiseworthy are the purposeful actions of the Indian authorities to eradicate poverty, to strengthen the public health infrastructure, to ensure access for children to free quality education. We recommend that India continue this work. We support the implementation of the government programme to ensure housing for the poor in rural areas. We welcome the review that was undertaken of the National Voluntary Guidelines on Corporate, Social, Economic and Environmental Responsibility of Businesses, with a view to bringing them into line with the UN's guiding principles on business and human rights and the SDGs. We recommend continuing efforts to ensure responsible corporate behaviour. Thank you.
Spasiba. Tiene la palabra Samoa.
Samoa is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. We warmly welcome and thank the delegation of India for your report, and we wish you success in the preparation of your National Action Plan on Human Rights. Samoa welcomes the Supreme Court's interpretation equating the right to live in a healthy environment with the right to life and recommends for India to adopt concrete measures implementing the right to live in a healthy environment, in particular to water and sanitation. We recommend continuing government efforts in the protection of mangroves, forests, marine biodiversity, and coastal systems. We further recommend that India adopt disaster risk reduction measures that will adequately protect people from the unavoidable impacts of the climate crisis. I thank you.
Thank you. Le vamos a dar ahora la palabra.
We will now give the floor to the distinguished delegation of India, who can address the comments and observations made thus far. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking all the states that have intervened from the floor so far. I'll now address some of the issues touched upon by them. First, let me speak upon the question of human rights defenders. India appreciates the role played by human rights defenders, civil society groups, and journalists in a democratic polity, contributing to our goals of keeping it open, pluralistic, and inclusive. India has always condemned instances of harassment, intimidation, smear campaigns, and violent attacks against human rights defenders, activists, and journalists, and their family members. At the same time, the activities of the human rights defenders should be in conformity with the law of the land. India is committed to ensure a safe environment for people engaged in promotion and protection of human rights, and have introduced a number of legislative and executive measures to facilitate their work. The Right to Information Act 2005 has enabled the people to secure access to information under the control of the public authorities and thereby promote transparency and accountability. The Whistleblowers Protection Act 2014 establishes a mechanism to receive complaints against public servants and provide adequate safeguards against victimization of the persons making such disclosures. National Human Rights Commission has set up a dedicated 24/7 focal point for receiving and examining complaints about alleged violation of human rights of human rights defenders. In addition, they can also approach the judiciary for the redressal of any alleged violations. So far as the question raised by the member states concerning the FCRA is concerned, India is a home to over 100,000 vibrant, proactive and independent civil society organizations and NGOs, which play an important role in the protection and promotion of the human rights. The FCRA provides the basic framework under which NGOs wish to seek funds from abroad for their activities in India. The legal provisions of the Act are similar to regulations in other democratic countries. The process of registration under the Act is transparent and technology-driven. All data related to registration, renewal, annual returns, etc. are in public domain. In cases of refusal, reasons and provisions under the Act and rules are specifically cited and the applicant is duly informed. Even if any renewal application is rejected or cancelled, the organization can still continue its operation and receive foreign funds by seeking permission on a case-to-case basis. As per current data, 16,542 organizations are eligible to receive foreign funds under the Acts. Actions were taken against some organizations due to their illegal practices, including mala fide rerouting of money and willful and continuing violations of extant legal provisions, foreign exchange management rules, and tax laws of India. It is important to reiterate that civil society organizations are permitted to operate in India, but must do so in accordance with law. Now coming to the issue regarding Jammu and Kashmir, the entire Union territory of Jammu, Kashmir and Ladakh were and will always be an integral and inalienable part of India. After the constitutional changes and reorganization of the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir, the people of the region are now able to realize their full potential as in other parts of the country. Despite the continued threat of cross-border terrorism, the security situation has improved significantly in Jammu and Kashmir since August 2019. Extension of over 800 people-friendly and progressive central laws to the region has ensured better opportunities for all the people of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. These central laws include affirmative action for the vulnerable sections, the right to free and compulsory education, non-discriminatory inheritance laws, protection against domestic violence and empowerment of women, decriminalization of same-sex relations and conferment of rights to transgender persons. The Government of India has taken several steps for all-round development of Jammu and Kashmir, including restoration of democracy at the grassroots levels, good governance, unprecedented development of infrastructure, tourism and trade. This year, Jammu and Kashmir has already received over 16 million tourists, the highest ever so far. So far as the question concerning the freedom of religion or belief and right to minorities is concerned, my colleague from the Ministry of Minority Affairs has already outlined in detail various provisions in the Constitution, relevant legislations and other administrative measures to ensure welfare of minorities who have continued to prosper and grow. I would like to reiterate that India is a multilingual, multi-ethnic and multi-religious society, and we not only respect but celebrate our diversity. The provisions embodied in the Constitution of India related to freedom of religion have evolved over the years through robust legislations and spirited interpretation by the constitutional courts. Further, various states in India have enacted Freedom of Religion Act to ensure freedom of religion guaranteed under the Constitution. Such legislations impose restrictions on and prohibit conversions from one religion to another by the use of force, inducement, allurement, or fraudulent means. Referring to such legislation as anti-conversion laws would be a misnomer. The Supreme Court has upheld the constitutional validity of states' Freedom of Religion Act. So far as the question concerning the abolition of death penalty is concerned, in India, death penalty is imposed only in rarest of rare cases when the alternative option is unquestionably foreclosed, where the crime committed is so heinous that it shocks the conscience of the society. While imposing death sentence, the court has to record its special reasons for arriving at such a drastic conclusion. There is no mandatory death sentence for any offence, since it runs contrary to those statutory safeguards which gives judiciary the discretion in the matter of imposing the death penalty. There are requisite procedural safeguards under the law, including right to a fair hearing by an independent court, presumption of innocence, guarantee for defence, and right to review by higher courts. Death penalty in India must necessarily be confirmed by the Superior Constitutional Court, whether challenged by the accused, convict or not. The Supreme Court of India has adopted guidelines on clemency and treatment of death row prisoners, wherein poverty, socio-economic, psychic compulsions, undeserved adversities in life constitute new mitigating factors to be considered by courts in commuting a death sentence to life imprisonment. Where death sentence is imposed, multiple avenues of review of death penalty are available to the death convict, including at the judicial level and at the executive level. The President of India and the governors of the states have the power to grant pardon, reprieves, respites, or remissions of the punishment, or to suspend, remit, or commute the sentence of death. There is also a provision to file a curative petition under the Constitution of India, where the Supreme Court of India can review its own judgment or the order. Thank you, Mr. President. Now I hand over the floor back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Seguimos con la lista.
Thank you. We will now continue with the list of speakers and we move on to Saudi Arabia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. أود في البداية.
Thank you, President. I would like to begin by commending the presence of the Public Prosecutor and the delegation here. I also welcome the presentation of the report, which reflects India's efforts to protect and promote human rights. In the context of this constructive dialogue, we have the following recommendations. Firstly, to step up efforts for socio-economic development with a focus on the rights to food and the most vulnerable categories of the population, to continue efforts to achieve the SDGs by reducing child mortality and maternal mortality rates, and also for child mortality for children under 5. We wish India a successful UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Senegal.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Senegal would like to thank the delegation of India for the presentation of the national report for this 4th UPR. My delegation welcomes the efforts made since the previous cycle, especially as regards the fight against poverty, in particular in rural areas, and universal access to healthcare, water and sanitation. Senegal also commends the actions carried out by the Indian authorities in the framework of the Paris Agreement and the fight against human trafficking, especially of women and children. We also commend reforms in the field of labour. We have the following recommendations for India: to consider ratifying the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhumane or degrading treatments, to consider ratifying the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of all Migrant Workers and their family members, and to consider responding in a favourable way to the request for visits from special mandate holders in accordance with the standing invitation by India. To conclude, we wish India every success. Thank you.
Serbia tiene la palabra.
Serbia, please.
Serbia welcomes the delegation of India at the UPR session and thanks it for presenting its national report. We commend the efforts of India in responding to the recommendations from the last UPR process. In particular, we welcome the legislative measures taken to strengthen the principle of equality and non-discrimination guaranteed by the Constitution of India and all the initiatives undertaken to improve the rights of vulnerable populations, in particular the youth and the elderly, as well as the adoption of a strategy for poverty alleviation that provides basic needs to a wide population. We note with appreciation the process of finalizing the trafficking of persons bill that seeks to address prevention, provide care, protection and rehabilitation to the victims, while placing special focus on women and children. We would like to recommend to India to continue its efforts to ensure that all children have access to good quality education at all levels. We also encourage India to further strengthen the measures to combat violence against women, as well as support victims and survivors of such violence. Serbia wishes India a successful and fruitful review process. Thank you.
Thank you. Sierra Leone.
Sierra Leone, please.
Mr. President, Sierra Leone welcomes the distinguished delegation from India to this review cycle and thanks them for the presentation. We recommend to India, 1, continue to raise public awareness about the prohibition of caste-based discrimination. 2, strengthen efforts to combat and eliminate child, early and forced marriages. 3, devote attention to intersectional effects of poverty on women's health care in affected communities. India is widely acknowledged as being a very diverse, multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, and multi-pluralistic society. We applaud the sense of cohesive functioning of its many interlinked organs and for establishing the national guidelines on responsible business conduct and the consolidation of its labor codes. Sierra Leone wishes India a successful review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Gracias.
Thank you. Singapore, please.
Laura.
Thank you, Mr. President. Singapore welcomes the delegation of India and commends them on the progress made since their last UPR. India has worked to expand universal access to affordable healthcare, which is timely given the threat of infectious diseases such as COVID-19. This includes the Ayushman Bharat scheme, launched in 2018, and further initiatives to improve both physical and digital healthcare infrastructure. Singapore recommends that India continue providing support to strengthen its national healthcare system, including with a focus on primary healthcare. We also recognize that enrollment in schools across India has improved over recent years, and that retention rates for students, including female students, have increased. Singapore recommends that India continue to emphasize education as a priority and allow all children to have access to quality and affordable education. Thank you.
Thank you. Slovakia.
Slovakia, please.
Thank you, President. Slovakia welcomes the delegation of India to this UPR session and thanks it for the presentation of its national report. We commend India for the adoption of the strategy for poverty alleviation, employing short and long-term initiatives and operationalizing holistic measurement of poverty by developing a national multidimensional poverty index. At the same time, we cannot ignore some negative trends in the freedom of expression. We invite India to ratify core UN human rights treaties to which it is not yet a party. Slovakia offers following recommendations to India. First, ratify the UNCTAD. Second, fully and legally abolish the death penalty. Third, effectively implement the prohibition of child labour. And fourth, properly apply the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act in compliance with international human rights standards. We wish India a successful review. I thank you, President.
Thank you. Slovenia tiene la palabra.
Slovenia, please.
Thank you, President. Slovenia applauds India's engagement in the UPR process and its efforts in implementing the recommendations from the previous rounds of review. We welcome and encourage further steps for inclusion of human rights education in schools as a tool to enable social cohesion, peace and prosperity, while addressing gender, digital and equity divide in education. In the latest 2021 report about crime in India, we noted that the number of criminal acts against women has increased by 15%. Based on this, we wish to recommend to India to adopt measures to ensure that the cases of violence against women and girls are properly addressed with adequate preventive and capacity building programs. I thank you.
Thank you. South Africa, you have the floor.
South Africa wishes to welcome the distinguished delegation of India to this UPR session and wishes the country a successful review. In this regard, South Africa recommends
that India ratify all the international instruments that it has signed and consider signing or ratifying those of which it's not yet party to, including the CAT, the ICPPED, the ICCPR, the Convention relating to the status of refugees and the protocol related to the status of refugees, the Convention relating to status of stateless persons, and the Convention on the reduction of statelessness. Second, that the government ensure that all forms of ill treatment of persons with disabilities constitute criminal offences in line with the definition of torture in international law, that cases of torture and ill treatment were investigated, prosecuted and perpetrators sanctioned, and that redress are provided for persons with disabilities who are subject to ill treatment. Lastly, that the government hold accountable public officials who advocate religious hatred.
South Sudan, please.
Sudan del Sur.
Mr. President, the delegation of the Republic of South Sudan welcomes the delegation of India and thank them for the presentation of the national report. My delegation commends India's efforts to develop a comprehensive Indian cooling action plan to address the cooling requirement across sectors and list out actions to help reduce the cooling demand. We recommend to India the following. 1. To continue its efforts to improve the environment and address climate change issues. 2. Redoubling government efforts to develop a multi-sectoral costed action plan to end violence against children. We wish India all the best and successful review. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. España tiene la palabra.
Spain, please. Thank you very much, President. We welcome the goodwill shown by successive governments to develop national legislation that protects and promotes the rights of women, and we commend the existence of multiple public institutions dedicated to promoting gender equality. However, many women and girls continue to suffer discrimination, exclusion and sexual violence. We recommend, firstly, to ratify the optional protocol to CEDAW on individual complaints and to criminalize marital rape as well as honor killings. We recommend, secondly, to enact the law on the prevention of community violence and to amend laws against minorities. We also recommend aligning national legislation with the CRPD and to undertake a constitutional reform to prohibit discrimination on grounds of disability. We also recommend considering introducing a moratorium on the death penalty and to commute any existing death sentences. Thank you. Thank you, Sri Lanka, please, via video.
Mr. President, Sri Lanka warmly welcomes the delegation of India and appreciates its comprehensive presentation. We acknowledge India's commitment to holistic, equitable and sustainable development goals and developmental initiatives undertaken with the objective of leaving no one behind. We also note the importance afforded to education, ensuring safe drinking water and sanitation in rural areas, ensuring the safety and security of women, and protection of persons with disabilities, including children. We take this opportunity to recommend that India continues and strengthens efforts to ensure access to education for all children, strengthens measures to combat violence against women and support victims and survivors of such violence, develop policies in line with sustainable development goals for the realization of the right to health. Finally, we wish India every success in its UPR engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. Sudan.
Sudan, please.
President, Sudan welcomes the delegation of India and welcomes the progress made by India since its last UPR. India has proved its solid adherence to the SDGs, which addresses the most crucial elements of human rights. The report submitted by India today indicated steady progress in areas such as provision of health, coverage, housing, potable water supplies, clean energy, and poverty eradication. Sudan recommends that India consider ratifying and acceding to the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and its 1968 protocols and Convention against torture, as well as the Convention on the Enforced Disappearance. I wish India a successful cycle of review. I thank you.
Thank you. Sweden.
Sweden, please.
Mr. President, Sweden acknowledges India's commitment to human rights. India has ratified several important international conventions on human rights. However, concerns remain with regard to the rights to freedom of expression, assembly and association, including on the Internet, women's safety and enjoyment of human rights, the pending ratification of the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment, and labor rights. Sweden would like to make the following recommendations. 1. Ratify the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. 2. Ratify ILO Convention 189 on domestic workers. I thank you.
Thank you. La Suisse.
Switzerland, please. You have the floor, Ambassador. Thank you, President. Switzerland welcomes the delegation of India, and we make the following recommendations. 1. To ensure open access to social network and to not impose any measure that would slow down or block internet connections. Secondly, to revise the Unlawful Activities Prevention Amendment Act and to assess its conformity with international law to ensure that it is not used against human rights defenders. Thirdly, to enact a new law and take necessary measures to prevent collective and targeted religious violence in accordance with human rights. Fourthly, to increase public expenditure in the field of healthcare to 2.5% of GDP, while also enacting a national law to ensure access to basic public health as a common good. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. Syria, please.
Shukran. Thank you, Mr. President. We welcome the distinguished delegation of India to the fourth cycle of the UPR. We commend India's commitment to achieve comprehensive, equitable, and sustainable development through the adoption of an approach based on the realization of the right to development. As the challenges of poverty continue, India continues its efforts to eradicate and alleviate it through a multifaceted strategy and the expansion of social protection programs, thus recording tangible progress in the implementation of the first Sustainable Development Goal. Our recommendations. We recommend India to take adequate steps to implement and evaluate rural development programs in order to ensure that these benefit the rural poor, in particular women and children. Second, to continue to strengthen measures to increase livelihood opportunities, especially for women empowerment, and to address rural poverty. I thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Tajikistan has the floor.
Mr. President, Republic of Tajikistan thanks the esteemed delegation of India for the comprehensive presentation of the national report and for the efforts made to implement the previous recommendations. We welcome India's strong commitment to address water-related issues on a priority basis, including implementation of the Water is Life program for achieving a universal access to safe and adequate drinking water by 2024. Tajikistan also appreciates the measures taken by India to ensure the promotion and protection of rights of persons with disabilities and to promote an inclusive and sustainable approach as well. In constructive spirit, my delegation would like to recommend the following. Further strengthen the efforts to support inclusive economic growth through sustainable utilization of available natural resources and to take further adequate steps to implement the rural development programs aimed to support vulnerable groups, in particular men and women and children. We wish the delegation of India every success in today's review. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Thailand.
Thank you. Thailand, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thailand welcomes the Solicitor General of India, Mr. Tushar Mehta, leading the Indian delegation to this UPR session. Thailand commends India for using digital technology to advance promotion and protection of human rights, especially in the universal health coverage and poverty eradication for vulnerable groups. Thailand notes India's endeavors to align its policies and practices with UN guiding principles on BHR. We recommend that India expedite the conclusion of the draft National Action Plan on BHR and further engage with stakeholders to guarantee its meaningful implementation. We also recommend India to intensify its effort to ensure free, compulsory and quality education to all children, in particular children in vulnerable situations. And we wish India a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. Timor-Leste.
Timor-Leste, please.
Sr. Presidente, Timor-Leste welcomes the progress made by India on human rights since its last UPR, including the establishment of the Ministry for Water Conservation and Management and policies to ensure universal access to safe and adequate drinking water, the adoption of the amendments to the Maternity Benefit Act, the Child Labour Act and the Children from Sexual Offences Act. Timor-Leste recommends that India strengthens efforts to ensure that the justice system adjudicates cases in a gender-sensitive manner, continues to invest in the public health workforce to prevent, prepare for, and respond to all types of health emergencies, including gender-based violence, and considers establishing a legislative framework that recognizes the human rights to water and sanitation, and that such legal recognition is harmonized. We wish India a very successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. Togo
has the floor. President, Togo commends the progress achieved by India since its previous UPR, in particular the granting of a constitutional status to the National Commission on Backward Castes, as well as the amendment of the law on the prevention of atrocities against scheduled castes, as well as positive action in favor of the most vulnerable groups of society. We would like to make the following recommendations. Firstly, to ratify the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Degrading or Inhumane Treatment and the optional protocol related thereto. Secondly, to ratify the optional protocol to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And thirdly, to accede to the Convention on the Status of Refugees and to the Protocol on the Status of Refugees. Togo would like to conclude by wishing India a very successful UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. Tunisia,
please.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. يرحب وفد.
Thank you, President. A cordial welcome to the Indian delegation. We thank them for the national report. We would like to commend India's efforts to implement the recommendations received during the previous UPR cycle. We have the following recommendations to make. Firstly, to continue efforts aimed at achieving the SDGs and to fight against climate change. To continue efforts aimed at implementing national policies against child labour and against violence against children, and to continue efforts to improve school enrollment rates, equal opportunities, and to ensure adult learning as well. A very successful UPR to India. Thank you.
Thank you. Turkey,
please.
Mr. President, Turkey welcomes the delegation of India. We appreciate the efforts by India towards realization of sustainable development goals. We trust that India's commitment to inclusivity and protection of human rights for all individuals, including members of minority communities, would only strengthen its status and credibility as the world's largest secular democracy with diverse cultures. In this spirit, we recommend India to take effective measures to prevent, persecute, and remedy discrimination and violence against Muslims and other religious minorities, condemn and address hate speech against Muslims and other minorities, take further action to combat trafficking in persons, including finalizing and implementing the Trafficking in Persons Bill, ensure the right to food to vulnerable sections of the population, and continue implementing measures aimed at poverty alleviation, including for women. Finally, regretting that solid peace and cooperation has not taken root between India and Pakistan even 75 years after their independence, we wish for a fair and lasting peace in Kashmir. Thank you.
Thank you. Turkmenistan,
please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Turkmenistan extends its warm welcome to the distinguished delegation of India and thanks it for the detailed presentation of the human rights-related accomplishments. We welcome the significant role of the National Human Rights Commission of India in the promotion and protection of human rights in an inclusive manner. Turkmenistan commends the government of India for ongoing efforts to develop its business responsibility framework to provide an enabling environment for improved participation of businesses in securing basic rights of the citizens. Along with that, we would like to submit the following recommendation. 1. To further strengthen work of the task force for preparation of India's National Plan of Action on Human Rights. 2. To continue implementing measures on strengthening of healthcare infrastructure, housing facilities, as well as support system for people of dependent on agriculture. In conclusion, Turkmenistan wishes the government of India a successful implementation of UPR recommendations of the fourth cycle. I thank you.
Thank you. Ukraine,
please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ukraine welcomes the delegation of India and thanks for the presentation of its national report. We welcome the adoption of multi-pronged strategy for poverty alleviation and operationalizing holistic measurement of poverty by developing national multidimensional poverty index. We encourage India to continue with further work and would like to recommend to review and make the amendments to all restrictive laws so it conforms with international law and its standards, to redouble their efforts to ratify the Convention Against Torture, to ratify the international human rights treaties and the relevant optional protocols to which India is not a party yet. Ukraine wishes India a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The United Arab Emirates, please.
سيد الرئيس يرحب وفد بلادي بوفد.
Thank you, President. We would like to welcome the Indian delegation led by Mr. Tushamina. And we would like to commend India's efforts to strengthen its human rights system. We commend India's efforts to implement the development plan for children despite obstacles in practice and despite the COVID-19 pandemic. We have two recommendations to make. Firstly, to support initiatives aimed at ensuring free education up until the age of 14, and secondly, to continue efforts with a view to fighting against climate change in full respect of human rights. Every success to India. Thank you.
Thank you. United Kingdom, tiene la palabra.
Yes, Senor Presidente, and let me warmly welcome the Solicitor General and his colleagues here today, and let me thank India for its continued engagement with the UPR and welcome India's commitment to implement the Convention Against Torture. We urge India to ensure its existing laws against child labour, human trafficking and forced labour are fully implemented. We recommend in particular that it set out plans for the ratification and implementation of the Convention Against Torture, that it reinforce efforts to protect the rights of all minorities as enshrined in the Indian Constitution, and that it ensure progress in the implementation of the Protection of Children Against Sexual Offences Bill and enhance protective mechanisms for child victims. Thank you, and I didn't even mention the cricket.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. Tanzania, please.
The Republic of Tanzania congratulates India for the comprehensive national report and welcomes the update. We acknowledge the progress made by India towards achieving the development agenda and improve the lives of its people. We note the various measures taken in the education and health sectors. We recommend India to consider taking steps towards improving access to maternal health, as well as continue its efforts in implementing its comprehensive policies to ensure quality education for all children. We congratulate India for ensuring that more than 94% households have access to improved drinking water sources. We therefore recommend the government to continue to implement policies to increase access to safe and clean drinking water in rural areas.
Thank you. United States of America, tiene la palabra.
United States welcomes the distinguished Indian delegation. We share with India, the world's largest democracy, the values of democracy, free speech, pluralism, and tolerance. And we encourage India to continue striving toward those ideals in consultation with civil society. We recommend that India, 1, reduce the broad application of the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and similar laws against human rights activists, journalists, and religious minorities. 2, ratify the Convention Against Torture and prosecute those responsible for human rights abuses. 3, improve the transparency of license adjudications related to Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, FCRA, and create easier pathways for NGOs to appeal adverse government decisions on FCRA licenses. Despite legal protections, discrimination and violence based on gender and religious affiliation persist. The application of anti-terror legislation has led to prolonged detentions of human rights defenders and activists, often on a pre-trial status. We wish the Indian delegation a successful UPR. I thank you.
Thank you. Uruguay tiene la palabra.
Thank you. Uruguay, please. Thank you very much, President. Uruguay would like to welcome the delegation of India, whom we thank for the report. We commend their efforts, which, for instance, include the enactment of the law on the protection of the rights of transgender persons. Encouraged by this commitment, we have the following recommendations. Firstly, to increase the financial and human resources allocated to implementing the protection mechanisms for children and teenagers with a view to eradicating child labour and child marriage, as well as sexual exploitation. To adopt an effective framework for protecting human rights defenders and journalists, which would protect them against acts of persecution, intimidation or harassment. To continue efforts to implement the law on the protection of the rights of transgender persons. Finally, Uruguay wishes India a successful 4th UPR. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Uzbekistan, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Uzbekistan welcomes the distinguished delegation of India for submitting the national report. We commend the efforts taken by the government of India to promote and protect economic, social and cultural rights of its people, as well as the adoption of strategy for poverty alleviation. Our delegation makes the following recommendations. First, take all necessary measures for strengthening the national human rights institutions within the framework of Paris principles. Second, continue further practical measures to protect and promote the rights of children and persons with disabilities. We wish distinguished delegation of India a successful review of the national report. I thank you.
Thank you.
Vanuatu, please.
Laura.
Thank you, Mr. President. Vanuatu welcomes the delegation of India and thanks them for their insightful presentation. While noting the positive efforts made by India in protection and promotion of human rights, Vanuatu would like to make the following recommendations. 1. Review and repeal the draft 2020 Environmental Impact Assessment Notification and reverse the dilution of environmental land and mining laws to ensure a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. 2. Ratify or accede to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And 3. Extend standing invitation to all UN special procedures. Vanuatu wishes India a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. Venezuela.
Venezuela has the floor via Zoom. Thank you, President. We welcome the distinguished delegation of India. We commend you on your success in implementing UPR recommendations, particularly those to raise the well-being of women and children, persons with disabilities and vulnerable communities. India's made significant progress in economic development and fighting poverty. Free health coverage is provided to over 500 million people, and efforts being made to take water to rural homes by 2024. We congratulate you and recommend that you consider taking extra measures to implement laws and existing policies to fight sex crimes against women and children, to strengthen your social programs to increase income-generating opportunities, particularly to empower women and to tackle rural poverty, and continue to strengthen policies to ensure that persons with disabilities can enjoy their rights in the framework of the Accessible India campaign. Thank you. I call on Vietnam.
We warmly welcome the delegation of India and thank them for the report today. We commend India's efforts and progress made in advancing human rights since the last UPR cycle. Vietnam makes the following recommendations to India. 1. Continue to strengthen measures for increasing lively opportunities and addressing rural poverty, especially for women empowerment. 2. Continue strengthening the legislation on prohibition of child marriage to eradicate child and forced marriage. 3. Continue its efforts to address negative impacts of climate change and develop relevant strategy for mitigating the impact of climate change on the effective enjoyment of human rights. We wish India every success. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yemen.
I call on Yemen by video.
Mr. President, we would like to welcome the delegation of India and we would like to voice our appreciation for the presentation and its details in which we have reviewed all the achievements made by the government of India in the field of human rights. The government of India has adopted a multifaceted strategy in order to alleviate poverty using short and long-term initiatives. Also, India has committed itself to take categoric measures to combat trafficking in persons and to support the victims and protect them, including the implementation of the terms of the United Nations Convention on Organized Crime. We commend all the efforts made by India in the field of human rights, and we recommend India to continue working and making every effort so that a law against the trafficking in persons would be adopted, as well as providing assistance and prevention and the rehabilitation of the victims. Thank you.
Thank you. Zambia tiene
I call on Zambia.
Zambia welcomes the distinguished delegation of India to the fourth cycle of the UPR, thanks them for the comprehensive national report, and commends them for the establishment of the task force on preparation of a national plan of action on human rights. Zambia recommends the following: 1, prohibition of corporal punishment in schools; 2, provision of holistic and gender-sensitive support to victims and survivors of sexual violence from marginalized communities; and 3, prohibition of all forms of labor, child labor up to the age of 18. We wish India a successful review. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Algeria has the floor.
Mr. President, Algeria warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of India. We welcome India's commitment to reform its legal system with a view to protecting and promoting the rights of women and girls. We also commend India for undertaking proactive policies to address health, education, housing, poverty alleviation, food and social security. We would like to make the following recommendations. Firstly, pursue efforts to combat violence against women and children at the national and local levels through sustained improvement of services in public health centers, hospitals, and regional and technical units on the protection of women and children. Secondly, continue national efforts to realize social and economic development and eradicate poverty and achieve comprehensive sustainable development for all. We wish India a successful review cycle. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Angola.
I call on Angola.
Thank you, Mr. President. Angola welcomes the delegation of India to this cycle. We note that India has taken effective measures to strengthen its human rights framework while developing institutional infrastructure for the promotion of human rights. We particularly welcome the implementation of a comprehensive development strategy through accelerated economic growth and broader social safety nets with a special focus on vulnerable groups. Angola encourages India to continue taking steps to protect and strengthen women's rights in all areas and recommends the following: to take concrete measures to protect the rights of religious minorities against all forms of violence and discrimination, to mainstream the fight against leprosy through poverty reduction programs, to consider ratifying the UN Convention Against Torture. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Argentina tiene la palabra.
I call on Argentina. President, Argentina congratulates India on implementing a number of programs for older persons during 2021. In addition, we have the following recommendations. 1, adopt additional measures to ratify the International Convention for Protecting All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. 2, revise and amend the law on protecting the rights of transgender persons from 2019 in order to allow official identity documents to be issued for these persons, including the adoption of measures to effectively prevent violence by institutions and police forces against trans persons. And 3, abolish the death penalty for all crimes and all circumstances by initially declaring a moratorium on executions. Thank you. Thank you. I call on Armenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Armenia warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of India and thanks for the presentation of report. India is indeed the largest democracy in the world, whose remarkable progress and best practices we have been attentively studying. In the spirit of close cooperation, we recommend to continue prioritizing active work towards reduction of neonatal and maternal mortality rates, to further expand investment in the public health workforce, education and training, and given India's amazing IT achievements, to further address the gender and equity divide in digital education. We wish India every success and productive fourth review. I thank you.
Thank you. Australia.
I call on Australia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Australia welcomes India's efforts since 2017. In the interest of time, I'll just move straight to the recommendations. Australia recommends India, 1, ensure civil society is able to operate without interference by establishing grievance redressal and appellate processes to increase transparency and support the application of the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. 2, establish a formal moratorium on the death penalty with a view to ratifying the second optional protocol to the ICCPR. 3, strengthen accountability measures by collecting and publishing data in a timely manner to enable objective monitoring and evaluation of human rights indicators. And 4, ratify the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and finalise the draft national policy for persons with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you. Bahamas.
I call on Bahamas.
Mr. President, we thank the delegation of India for its report and commend progress made since the last review. In a constructive spirit, the Bahamas recommends that India, 1, accelerate efforts to ratify the UN Convention Against Torture, 2, scale up efforts to address food insecurity among women and poor and vulnerable children, including by tackling root causes such as social norms which contribute thereto, and 3, bring domestic legislation in line with the provisions of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We positively recognize efforts by India to promote a fair and inclusive society, including through its extensive food safety net programs, and commend the commitment of India to providing developmental assistance and capacity building to other countries and regions, such as the provision of vaccines during the pandemic, which benefited countries such as the Bahamas. We wish India a successful UPR. I thank you.
Thank you. Bahrain.
I call on Bahrain.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of Bahrain welcomes the delegation of India and thanks them for their presentation. We welcome India's efforts to the promotion and protection of human rights since its last review, and we commend its initiatives during the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic and its efforts in addressing violence against women and girls. In spirit of the constructive cooperation, we offer the following recommendations. First, consider further efforts for rural infrastructure development with a view to eliminate poverty. Second, continue efforts to expand universal health coverage and ensure social security for all Indians. Third, continue efforts to combat trafficking in persons and support and protect victims. The Kingdom of Bahrain wishes India a successful review. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Bangladesh.
I call on Bangladesh.
Thank you, Mr. President. Bangladesh thanks the distinguished delegation of India for its comprehensive presentation. We congratulate India for its remarkable achievements in ensuring universal access to affordable health care and free education to children, improving nutrition, poverty eradication, despite the COVID-related challenges. We are happy to note Indian emphasis on equality and non-discrimination and its legislative initiatives to address human trafficking. We are confident and we expect that the Indian human rights situation will continue to match its democratic credentials. In this spirit, Bangladesh recommends India to intensify its efforts in implementing its comprehensive policies to ensure quality education for all children and improve access to safe and clean drinking water and sanitation. We wish India a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. Belarus.
I call on Belarus.
Thank you, President. We welcome the distinguished delegation of India and we thank them for the presentation of the substantive national report. We note the broad range of human rights obligations of India and the significant progress achieved by the government to implement them. In particular, there has been improvement of legislation as well as better protection for vulnerable categories of the population and better access to education and medical services. We welcome the government's efforts and the specific outcomes achieved linked to the social security system population and efforts made to reduce violence against girls and children and more effective ways of fighting human trafficking. In the spirit of our constructive partnership, we would like to recommend the following: to continue work towards joining the international instruments in the field of human rights and to ratify them. We wish India every success. Thank you.
Thank you. Bélgica.
I call on Belgium.
Thank you, Mr. President. Belgium welcomes the delegation of India and appreciates India's efforts in addressing violence against women. We are convinced that further progress can be achieved to address gender-based violence and support human rights defenders. Therefore, Belgium recommends India to 1. Remove the exception related to marital rape from the definition of rape in Section 375 of the Indian Penal Code. 2. Repeal or amend the Foreign Contribution Act 2020 to ensure the right to freedom of association in line with the ICCPR. 3. Repeal or revise the Penal Code as well as the Unlawful Activities Act to ensure the right to freedom of expression in conformity with the ICCPR. 4. Withdraw the Armed Forces Act 1958 and 1990 from the districts where it remains fully or partially in jurisdiction. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Benin.
I call on Benin. We thank India for presenting its national report, which highlights meaningful progress in human rights since the previous UPR cycle. Our delegation also hails progress in good governance, fighting poverty and environmental protection. Our recommendations: 1. Strengthen the combat against human trafficking and slavery. 2. Ratify the Convention Against Torture and its optional protocol. 3. Ratify the 2 optional protocols to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Benin wishes India every success in the review. Thank you. Thank you. I call on Bhutan.
Bhutan welcomes the concrete efforts made by India in implementing its human rights obligations, particularly those guided by its developmental agenda. Bhutan also welcomes the measure to mitigate the impact of the pandemic and applaud India's generosity in donating COVID vaccines to many countries during the crisis. Bhutan commends India's policy initiatives to address poverty through various poverty alleviation measures. We also note the measures taken such as amendment of the criminal law on sexual harassment, increased penalty for rape of girl child, and the setting up of health centers for victims of sexual offences. We recommend the following: 1. To continue its efforts in addressing rural poverty, and 2. Take further steps to combat sexual offence against women and children. We wish India every success in its review. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Botswana.
I call on Botswana.
Mr. President, we welcome the delegation of the Republic of India to the 4th cycle of the UPR process and thank them for their comprehensive national report. We note with appreciation that India supported both our recommendations submitted during their last review, which were to take all appropriate measures in the implementation of the 2015 Juvenile Justice Act to give children aged 18 years and below an opportunity for rehabilitation and to ratify the Convention Against Torture. However, we take note that the consideration of the latter remains outstanding. In that regard, Botswana recommends that India ratifies the optional protocol on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. 2. Ensures universal health care coverage and access for all persons with disabilities in rural and urban areas. We wish India a successful UPR outcome. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Brazil tiene la palabra.
Brazil has the floor.
Thank you. Brazil welcomes the delegation of India to the 4th cycle of the UPR. We appreciate India's commitments to seeking universal access to affordable health care for all, and in particular India's sense of responsibility and solidarity by sharing COVID vaccines and response products to more than 150 countries. We commend India for aligning the national voluntary guidelines on socio-economic and environmental responsibility of business with the UN principles and the SDGs. With the spirit of constructive dialogue, Brazil recommends India to strengthen efforts to implement labor laws, especially concerning informal workers and women workers, and to consider adopting regulations on the protection of persons that ensure the rights of freedom and expression and privacy in accordance with the existing international standards. We wish India a successful review.
Thank you. Brunei.
I call on Brunei Darussalam.
Thank you, Mr. President. Brunei thanks India for the presentation and welcomes the steps taken in implementing recommendations from the previous cycle. In particular, we commend India's commitment in the area of adequate housing through programs such as the NULM and Smart Cities Mission, which has reduced poverty and enabled its people to access gainful self-employment and skilled wage employment opportunities. However, we note with concern on the report of attacks on minority communities and instances of religious intolerance, violence, and discrimination. Mr. President, Brunei proposes the following recommendations. 1, to continue implementing various schemes and measures to ensure inclusive access to adequate housing and basic amenities. And 2, prioritize efforts to ensure that persons with disabilities are afforded the same right to education as all. We wish India a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. Bulgaria.
I call on Bulgaria.
Thank you, President. Bulgaria warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of India. We appreciate the reinforcement of the constitutional principles of equality and non-discrimination through various legislative, institutional and policy measures after the third UPR cycle. Bulgaria applauds the successful implementation of poverty alleviation programs by the Indian government and commends India's progress in providing access to affordable health care for all and ensuring free and compulsory education for all children in the age of 6 to 14 years. We would like to make the following recommendations. 1, take further measures to promote women's participation in the workforce, including through equal pay, skills development, job retention during pregnancy and maternity, and return to work opportunities after maternity. 2, complete the review process to bring the legislation, policies and schemes for the protection of the rights of persons with disabilities in line with the provisions of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We wish the delegation of India a successful review. Gracias, Presidente.
Gracias, Embajador.
Thank you, Ambassador. Burkina Faso has the floor by video. Thank you. We bid a warm welcome to the Indian delegation and thank it for presenting its national report. We applaud India's efforts to implement recommendations accepted during the previous UPR cycle, which have led to a drop in maternal mortality from 122 to 103 per 100,000 live births by 2019. Whilst we encourage India to pursue its efforts and in a spirit of constructive dialogue, we have the following recommendations. 1, to ensure access to water and sanitation services on an equal footing regardless of the place or status of residence. And 2, strive to ensure that persons with disabilities have access to public services in an inclusive and non-discriminatory fashion, particularly in rural areas. We wish India a successful review. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I call on Burundi. Thank you, President. The Burundian delegation welcomes the Indian delegation and congratulates it on accepted recommendations. We appreciate India's determination to promote human rights in all spheres of life. We recommend the following. 1, to pursue these efforts to improve the environment, take measures to promote access to free education and health for all, free education and affordable health for all. We wish India every success. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I call on Cambodia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Cambodia recognizes India's ongoing efforts to review legislation and to undertake legal reforms in line with its commitment to international human rights obligations. Cambodia commends measures taken by India to implement recommendations in the adoption of its third UPR cycle. In the constructive spirit, Cambodia would like to put forward 2 recommendations. 1, continue efforts and measures to increase safe and sustainable drinking water in rural areas and to improve sanitation coverage, especially for indigenous communities and most vulnerable groups. 2, continue effort to promote women's rights and to eliminate violence against women and girls through effective legislation and law enforcement measures. I wish the delegation of India every success in this review. I thank you.
Thank you. Cameroon.
I call on Cameroon. Thank you, President. The delegation of Cameroon congratulates India for its brilliant and informative report to the 41st session of the UPR. India has made a lot of progress. It's definitely on the up. We have the following recommendations. 1, to grant the highest level of priority to women's safety by making a commitment to eradicate all forms of discrimination against women and promoting their empowerment. 2, pursue efforts to protect children from sexual exploitation, corporal punishment, child marriage and labour, and support victims of sexual crimes. 3, pursue the protection of persons with disabilities, and 4, continue efforts to integrate scheduled castes and tribes into the development process. We wish you every success in implementing the recommendations accepted. Thank you. I call on Canada.
Thank you, Mr. President. Canada welcomes the steps taken by India to improve economic and social rights for all, including women and girls. Canada recommends that India, 1, improve the enforcement of laws relating to sexual violence, investigating all acts of sexual violence, providing training to law enforcement officials on effective interventions, and expanding the definition of rape and sexual assault to include marital rape. Number 2, to protect freedom of religion by investigating all cases of religious violence and discrimination on religious grounds, including against Muslims, condemning these cases and sensitizing the public on religious tolerance. 3, strengthen media freedom by ensuring that all legislation, including the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, is compliant with India's international obligations under human rights law. And 4, address violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Thank you.
Gracias. Chile.
Thank you. I call on Chile. Thank you, President. We bid a cordial welcome to the Indian delegation and thank it for presenting its national report. In a constructive spirit, we recommend 1, work towards ratifying the Convention Against Torture. 2, consider taking measures to establish a moratorium on the death penalty, which will lead to its abolition. 3, study measures to reduce discrimination against women, including training of law enforcement officers in protecting the victims of sexual violence. Lastly, we recognise India's progress towards equality and non-discrimination. We wish India every success in this 4th cycle of the UPR. Thank you. I call on China.
主席先生。
Thank you, President. The Chinese delegation has 3 recommendations for India. Firstly, continue to promote economic and social development on a sustainable basis which will allow all Indians to enjoy their human rights. 2, take measures to fight human trafficking. And 3, to pursue gender equality. We commend India on its progress in economic and social development and strengthening the coverage of social security. We do hope that India will have a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. Congo tiene la palabra.
Congo has the floor. Congo welcomes the Indian delegation and congratulates it on the presentation of its national report. India has made a number of efforts to promote and protect human rights since the last cycle. Meaningful progress has been made in economic and social rights in particular, and especially when it comes to health and education. Furthermore, my country applauds India's commitment to human rights thanks to its funding of the Office of the High Commissioner. We have the constructive recommendations as follows: to fight against debt servitude by rigorously applying the 2016 law prohibiting it, to ratify the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment. Lastly, Congo wishes India every success in its UPR. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Costa Rica has the floor. Thank you very much, President. Costa Rica thanks India for presenting its national report, and we have the following recommendations. 1, adopt a legal definition from the WHO on female genital mutilation, criminalise it, and implement a national plan to eradicate it. 2, establish 18 as the minimum age for marriage throughout the country. 3, develop an action plan to eradicate all forms of discrimination against Dalits and promote their integration in the private and public labour markets, promote the right to a clean, healthy environment in the Constitution, ensure freedom of expression and remove obstacles to accessing information online, to extend the coverage of supplies of drinking water and sanitation. Thank you. Thank you. Côte d'Ivoire has the floor. I'm not sure if you're on Zoom or in the room. Thank you, President. Côte d'Ivoire thanks the Indian delegation for presenting its national report. We congratulate India on its activities to promote human rights through training provided to civil servants in human rights in general, and in particular on collective rights. We encourage the Indian authorities to pursue their efforts, and we have the following recommendations. 1, ratify the Convention on the Status of Refugees, and to speed up the prosecution of violence against women and have a health sector response to gender-based violence at all levels. Côte d'Ivoire wishes India every success in the review. Thank you. I call on Croatia.
Mr. President, Croatia welcomes the delegation of India and thanks them for their report. We welcome the government's efforts in improving overall human rights situation in the country. However, we are concerned about the use of death penalty in recent years. We encourage the government to take steps towards the moratorium on the use of death penalty and to ensure the respect of international standards that provide safeguards guaranteeing protection of the rights of those facing the death penalty. We have 3 recommendations. 1, address structural disadvantages faced by marginalized communities in accessing education, including Christian community. 2, decriminalize defamation and libel and strengthen an independent broadcast media authority. 3, ratify the 2nd optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, aiming at the abolition of the death penalty. We wish the delegation of India a successful review session. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Cuba tiene la palabra.
Cuba is recognized. Thank you very much, Mr. President. We would like to extend a warm welcome to the delegation of India and to thank them for the presentation of the report. We acknowledge their commitment to the UPR review. We would like to recommend, first, continue making efforts in the effective implementation of the General Plan on the Rights of the Elderly so as to ensure their well-being and their rights. 2, to continue to strengthen the legal framework as well as public policies to mitigate poverty with a view to eradicating it, and along those lines to continue to give priority to the most vulnerable groups. We wish India every success in this review. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Cyprus has the floor.
Mr. President, Cyprus welcomes the distinguished delegation from India and for the presentation of its report. Cyprus commends India for progress made since the last UPR cycle, including significant strides in poverty reduction. The Supreme Court's 2018 decriminalization of consensual adult same-sex relationship was a major step in mitigating discrimination. Cyprus wishes to recommend ratify the 1st and 2nd optional protocols to the ICCPR and the optional protocol to the ICESCR. Enhance legal provisions combating discrimination against women and girls, continue efforts to effectively enforce environmental policies, organize campaigns and educational programs to raise awareness of the importance of cultural heritage in all its diversity. I thank you.
Thank you. República Checa.
Thank you. The Czech Republic has the floor.
The Czech Republic welcomes the delegation of India and appreciates the improvement of legal provisions upholding women's rights. We wish to recommend to recognize domestic workers in India's 4 labor codes and recognize their right to collective social security benefits. To introduce comprehensive sex education in the Indian school curriculum to increase the students' awareness, train teachers, and prepare information materials for families. To repeal the crimes of sedition and criminal defamation in the Indian Penal Code in order to be in line with international standards on freedom of expression. to enact and implement domestic legislation on the rights of persons belonging to national or ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities. Finally, to guarantee freedom of expression and carry out independent investigation of all cases of attacks on journalists, including arbitrary detention and intimidation, especially in Jammu and Kashmir. We wish India a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. Último orador.
Thank you. And our last speaker is the Gambia, through a video statement.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of the Gambia warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of India and thank them for their continued and constructive engagement with the UPR mechanism. Mr. President, the Gambia welcomes and takes note that the Constitution of India guarantees free and compulsory education of all children between the ages of 6 to 14 as a fundamental right. We equally take note and welcomes India's efforts towards ensuring that persons with disabilities are better protected to promote more inclusivity. Mr. President, while recognizing the efforts being put in place by the Government of India towards child protection, my delegation would like to make the following recommendations. 1. For India to strengthen its laws and implementation structure at all levels to eradicate all forms of child labor, child trafficking, and domestic violence against children. For India to ensure that the justice system is responsive to women and disabilities and guarantee their rights for privacy and safety. And I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Many thanks. Now we would like to give the floor to the Indian delegation for its final comments. Thank you.
Mr. President, Excellencies and distinguished delegates, let me take this opportunity to thank you all for your participation in India's 4th UPR. We have heard and taken careful note of your comments, queries, and recommendations. I have already responded to some of the issues raised by the member states during my previous intervention. I'll try to respond to as many remaining issues as possible within the limited time available. So far as the question concerning torture or enforced disappearance is concerned, let me underline that India condemns any form of torture and maintains an inviolable stand against arbitrary detention, torture, rape, or sexual violence by anyone. The Constitution of India guarantees to every person the right to life and personal liberty, which the Supreme Court of India has interpreted to include the right to live with dignity. India is a signatory to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, as well as International Convention for the Protection of all persons from enforced disappearances, and remains committed to ratifying the conventions. The 273rd report of the Law Commission of India has provided its recommendations on the implementation of convention along with the draft Prevention of Torture Bill. Since the subject falls under the concurrent list under our Constitution, the central government needs to take into account the opinion of states in this regard. The recommendation and the draft have been circulated to all the state governments and union territories for their comments. Further, the existing legal framework in India, such as provisions under the Constitution, Indian Penal Code, the Code of Criminal Procedure, among others, guarantees adequate protection against any form of arbitrary detention, torture, and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. As remedial measure against torture, courts in India have recognized victims' compensation, and in some instances, courts and the National Human Rights Commission have even directed payment of compensation, to which the state has duly complied. As regards the freedom of speech and opinion is concerned, the Constitution of India guarantees to every citizen the fundamental right to freedom of speech and expression. Like any other freedom, the freedom of speech and expression is not absolute in nature and is subject to reasonable restrictions in the interest of sovereignty and integrity of India, security of the state, friendly relations with the foreign state, public order, decency or morality, contempt of court, defamation, or incitement to an offence. As is evident, these restrictions are conceived to protect national and public interest and are required to meet a very high threshold. They are in consonance with Article 19, Sub-Article 3 of ICCPR, being a fundamental right, any restriction imposed is amenable to judicial review by the constitutional courts in India, including by directly approaching the Supreme Court of India. Imposing reasonable restrictions enables the state to regulate freedom of speech and expression when it amounts to hate speech or leads to incitement to an offence. Nevertheless, it is a settled law in India that any restriction imposed must not be excessive or disproportionate. For instance, the Supreme Court in Shreya Singhal versus Union of India in the year 2015 struck down Section 66A of the Information Technology Act 2000 as vague, unconstitutional and imposing unreasonable restriction on the freedom of speech and expression. So far as the Citizenship Amendment Act CAA 2019 is concerned, it is a limited and focused legislation which reaffirms India's commitment to the welfare of persecuted minorities in the region. This is similar to laws that exist elsewhere in defining specific criteria for citizenship pathways. The criteria defined here is specific to India and its neighbourhood and takes into account the historical context and the current ground realities. It is aimed at enabling foreigners of 6 minority communities, namely Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Parsi and Christian community from 3 specified neighbouring countries who have migrated to India owing to their religious persecution in those countries to obtain Indian citizenship. It will help in reducing their statelessness and would enable beneficiaries to have a more secured and dignified life. This act neither takes away citizenship of any Indian citizen, nor amends nor abridges any existing process for acquiring Indian citizenship by any foreigner of any country belonging to any faith or religion. So far as legislations concerning anti-terrorism and national security laws like UAPA are concerned, I would like to begin by saying that we have been facing terrorism from several decades. The state has a responsibility to protect its own citizens against the terrorist acts. We have enacted legislations like Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, Armed Forces within brackets Special Powers (over) Act, National Security Act to deal with the menace of terrorism and to protect the sovereignty, unity and integrity of India. These legislations have been enacted to secure a balance between the liberty of citizens and the security of the state. They have adequate safeguards inbuilt against any potential misuse. Operation of Armed Forces Special Powers Act is periodically reviewed by the Government of India after consultation with the state government concerned and the central agencies based upon the ground situation. Due to the improved security situation, the said act was withdrawn completely from the state of Tripura in May 2015, from the state of Meghalaya in April 2018. Further, in April 2022, it was withdrawn from 23 districts in Assam, partially from 7 districts in Nagaland and 6 districts in Manipur. These decisions are taken based upon the prevailing circumstances in each of the disturbed areas in order to protect the rights of the citizens. Mr. President, Excellencies and distinguished delegates, there were also observations, comments and recommendations related to key economic, social and cultural rights. India attaches high importance to implementation of these rights. Besides my opening remarks, brief statements made by representatives of various ministries of the Government of India have outlined the initiatives that we have taken to fulfill our obligations in respect of these rights, including our success in meeting sustainable development goals and creating an inclusive economy and society. Mr. President, Our participation in UPR has been informed by our democratic spirit. My delegation from different ministries and departments of the government will be returning with renewed commitment and new ideas for further strengthening our institutional, legislative and administrative framework for better protection and promotion of human rights of our people. We are aware of the challenges but remain steadfast to realize this goal. I thank you for your participation and kind attention. I now invite our Vice Minister, Ministry of External Affairs, Mr. Sanjay Verma, for our closing remarks.
Thank you, sir. Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, on behalf of the delegation of India, I sincerely thank you for your constructive participation and engagement in our Universal Periodic Review. It is encouraging that a large number of member states took to the floor today. We found the entire exercise of preparation for and participation in the UPR useful. We have tried to respond to as many issues raised as possible within the limited time frame. We are thankful for your observations as well as recommendations. We will duly reflect on them in consultation with various stakeholders, including civil society organizations. We value your comments and recommendations, which should undoubtedly be taken into consideration by my government in delineating the next steps for further advancing the goal of protection of human rights of our people. India remains deeply committed to multilateralism, the UN Charter and its founding principles. In our tenure as a member of the Security Council, which comes to an end this year, we have acted as a bridge on some serious but divisive issues confronting the Council. As we begin the G20 presidency next month, we are sensitive to the challenges faced by developing countries. India will work with other G20 members to address serious issues of debt, of economic growth, food and energy security, and particularly of environment. The reform of governance of multilateral financial institutions will continue to be one of our core priorities. Let me conclude by reiterating that the Government of India's abiding commitment is for the promotion and protection of human rights of our people, including providing good governance and realizing the inclusive and sustainable development for the welfare of our people. As an ancient civilization which is reclaiming prominence, India suggests that diversity can coexist and prosper together. As the world's largest democracy, India is committed to the highest standards of human rights. Unlike my colleague from the UK, we have absolutely no reason today to refer to cricket, but I thank you again for participating in this UPR. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank especially the delegation of India for all the work, the important high-level delegation that was here with us today. In the case of India being such an important country in size and population, as you said, a universal system that has a tool like this to address the human rights situation of such a big and populous country is indeed a very important tool for the world. So we thank the Indian delegation and also all the organizations in the country that I'm sure participated in the report and the follow-up of the recommendations. So agradezco la presentación.
I thank the delegation for the presentation and participation in the review. The reports will be prepared by the Troika, namely the representatives of Nepal, the Netherlands, and the Sudan. In accordance with the procedure implemented since 2015, the recommendations section is scheduled for distribution on Monday, the 14th of November at 6 p.m. And it will be considered for adoption on Wednesday, November 16th, as of 3:30 p.m. The full report, including the summary section, will be circulated by email on Friday, November 25th, 2022. This brings us to the end of our meeting. We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. for the review of Algeria. Speaking time will be 55 seconds for all. Inscribed speakers who wish to withdraw from the list are kindly invited to inform the Secretariat at least 30 minutes before the start of the review. I hereby close the 8th meeting of the 41st UPR Working Group session.